She had given that man everything. 48 years of waking before the sun to make sure his kingdom ran. 48 years of standing beside King Alpha Malachar in every hall, every season, every crisis. A steady presence he had learned to use the way you use a wall, leaning against it without ever once stopping to consider that walls, too, have a limit. She had loved him. That was the part that cost the most in the end. Not the betrayal. Betrayal, when it finally has a face, is almost a relief after decades of suspecting it in every corner. Not the humiliation of being dissolved before 200 witnesses, her most private grief read aloud from official parchment like a legal clause, the word barren given to a full hall as though it were simply a fact about land rather than a verdict on a woman's entire worth. No. The part that cost the most was understanding, in the silence after, that she had loved a man who had never existed. The man she had loved, patient, worthy of 48 years, had been a story she told herself in closed rooms, while the real man made other choices in lit ones. And the real man, when he finally showed himself completely, was so much smaller than the story that the grief of it was almost funny. Almost. She left with one trunk. A cracked carriage. 2 minutes of tears she counted precisely before she was done with them. She did not know, riding east on that empty road, that the world was about to show her the other side of the equation. She did not know that the land she was riding toward, dead for 30 years, gray and cracked and silent on every map ever drawn, had not died at all. It had been waiting. What Aveline Crow found at the end of that road was not what she had lost. It was something that had always known her name, but she did not expect that King Alpha Malachar would find out everything and would never allow things to be left in peace. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories. And you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. Sundown had not arrived yet, and they were already changing the locks. Aveline stood in the doorway of her own chamber and watched 2 servants strip the silver mirror from the wall, their movements brisk and practiced, as though they had been rehearsing this moment for longer than she knew. They didn't look at her. She had been dissolved 3 hours ago, and in this palace that was enough. She was already a ghost walking her own halls. 4 hours. That was what 48 years amounted to here. 4 hours to pack, 1 trunk allowed, and a retired carriage with a cracked wheel waiting in the courtyard below. She packed without trembling, and that surprised even her. The great hall had been full, not court full. Everyone full. Lords, elders, warriors. And this was the detail that told her everything. The kitchen staff, lined 3 deep along the far wall. You don't summon kitchen staff to a legal proceeding unless you want the story carried to every corner of the kingdom before morning. Malachar had planned this for a long time, and she could see it now the way you see a bruise only after it's already gone dark. She had walked in alone, spine straight, hands still. He stood on the dais in full alpha regalia, crimson and black, the silver chain of kingship across his chest, and beside him stood Vera. Not behind him, not off to the side, but right there, shoulder to shoulder, bold as the morning light flooding the high windows. The woman had poured wine at their table for 7 years and called Aveline my Luna with her eyes cast down. She was now wearing a gown worth more than a warrior's yearly wage, and she was not bothering to look apologetic about any of it. Aveline absorbed all of it in 2 seconds and kept walking. 48 years ago, you were bonded to this throne. Malachar's voice rolled through the hall, that alpha resonance filling every stone corner the way it always had, the sound she had once confused for safety. In that time, you have failed to produce an heir, failed to strengthen this bloodline, failed in the most fundamental duty of a Luna. He held up a scroll with the royal healer's seal on the ribbon, actually held it up and let the room look at it, And she understood then that he had rehearsed this gesture too, probably more than once. Baron, documented, witnessed. The word hit the hall like a stone dropped from a great height, and she felt it reach every wall and come back. 48 years of whispered suspicion, now handed to 200 people on official parchment. Someone to her left inhaled sharply, and Elder Crane rose from his seat, and two warriors near the door exchanged a look that said everything they were too careful to say aloud. Someone in the back, she never found out who, said, "This is wrong," loud enough for the whole room to hear, before Malachar silenced it with one raised hand. He set the scroll down and looked at her with the patience of a man who had already won. "Under the right of Alpha dissolution, I am terminating our bond at sundown. You will vacate these grounds tonight. No title, no funds, no lands, no escort." She looked at Vera, who was studying the middle distance with great concentration. She looked at Elder Crane, who had sat back down and was staring at his own hands. She looked at Malachar, who was already turning slightly toward Vera, already done with her, already tidying her away before she had even spoken. And something inside Aveline moved. Not broke. Moved. Slow and enormous and final, the way the earth moves before it decides to change shape. She smiled. 48 years, she said, steady and clear and loud enough for the kitchen staff along the far wall. "I kept every promise I made in this hall. I buried my grief in private so this pack never saw me waver." She held his gaze for one long, unhurried beat. "You documented my womb. You forgot to document my worth." She tilted her chin, not a bow, but something closer to a general acknowledging a battlefield she has already decided to leave, and turned toward the doors. "I'll be gone by sundown." Behind her, Malachar said nothing. For the first time in 48 years, he had no answer, and the silence he left behind her was the loudest thing she had ever heard in that hall. The carriage they gave her was an embarrassment. Retired from palace use 3 years ago, the rear wheel cracked. The driver a young man named Osric who gripped the reins with white knuckles and didn't speak for the first hour. She could tell he had been instructed not to. She sat with her trunk wedged against the opposite seat and watched the Voss lands move past the window. Forests she had walked, rivers she had named, villages where she had distributed grain through 3 hard winters. All of it hers in every way that mattered and in no way the law recognized. When the palace towers finally disappeared behind the hill, she let herself cry. 2 minutes, she counted, and then she was done. The wheel gave way an hour past the border marker. No warning, no slow deterioration, just one crack like a bone snapping, and then the world tilting and not stopping. She grabbed the doorframe as the carriage lurched sideways, felt the wood splinter under her fingers, and heard Osric shout from the driver's box and the horses scream, and then the carriage went fully over and drove every particle of air from her body at once. White. Ringing. Then the groan of settling wood, and the stamp of one horse still on its feet in the road, and then a voice, close and unhurried in a way that was almost strange given the circumstances, the voice of a man for whom this particular disaster required competence, not alarm. "Don't move yet. Where does it hurt?" When the door above her swung open, 2 large hands reached in. Scarred at the knuckles, the hands of a man who worked land, not throne rooms. She looked up into gold evening light that haloed the stranger's silhouette. Silver at his temples, a jaw that hadn't met a razor in several days, and dark eyes already moving over the wreckage with the calm of someone who had seen enough broken things to know how to read them. "I'm not hurt," she said. He glanced at her hands, still locked around the broken frame, and she followed his gaze to find blood across 3 knuckles. She hadn't felt it until he looked. She released the frame, took his hands, and he pulled her up and out in one clean motion, setting her on her feet in the road as though it were simply the next thing that needed doing. She looked at the overturned carriage, then at Osric sitting in the dirt. Unhurt, but staring at her with the expression of a man calculating exactly how much trouble this was going to cost him back at the palace. Then she looked east, toward the horizon where the maps ran out, and the cartographers had written 2 words in faded ink: moribund territory, dead ground, where nothing grew and nothing stayed. She was going there anyway. "Where are you headed?" the man asked. "There." She nodded east, and he looked at the dead land on the horizon, and then back at her without flinching. "Alone?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, as though simply deciding something. "My farm's 2 miles north. Come eat something first." No questions about who she was or what she'd lost, just the offer, plain and complete. The reflex to refuse was 48 years old. Her stomach made the decision before her pride could object. 1 hour, she said. He nodded once, as though 1 hour from a woman who had just lost everything was something to be respected rather than negotiated. Aldous Fenwick. Aveline. Just that. No title, no pack name, no history attached. He turned toward the north road, and she was about to follow when a voice rang out from the oak at the roadside, at a volume entirely disproportionate to the gravity of the moment. "Finally. I have been sitting in that tree since noon. Do you have any idea what bark does to a delicate spine?" Aveline stopped walking. On the lowest branch, tail curled around her paws, amber eyes bright and unapologetic, wearing the expression of someone who had absolutely not just been napping, sat a very old, very small fox. She dropped from the branch and landed with somewhat less grace than she'd intended, recovered immediately, and sat in the road as though that had been the plan all along. "Thistle," the fox announced. "I've been assigned to you by forces older than either of us, and I have opinions, many of them about everything. And that part is non-negotiable." She glanced at Aldous. "You can hear me too, which means you matter to what comes next." Then back to Aveline. "Now, can we please move? The dying lands are waiting, and I would very much like dinner before the century ends." Aveline looked at the fox, at the man, at the broken carriage behind her and the dead horizon ahead, and at this entirely impossible evening that had somehow become the first honest thing to happen to her in 48 years. She laughed, short and real and entirely unplanned, pulled out of her before she could think to stop it. And far to the east, beneath the cracked and silent surface of the dying land, a single root twitched. It had begun. Aldous Fenwick's farm was exactly 2 miles north, exactly as he had said, and exactly nothing like what Aveline had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something modest, perhaps, something appropriately humble for a man who lived alone on the border of dead territory. What she had not expected was the vegetable garden so immaculately kept, it looked like it had opinions about itself. Or the 3 dogs that came bounding from the porch the moment they heard footsteps on the path, or the way the whole property sat in the last of the evening light, as though it had been placed there deliberately, like a word chosen carefully in the middle of a long sentence. "You grow all of this yourself?" she asked, stopping at the garden gate. "Most of it." He held the gate open for her. "The tomatoes are difficult. They have moods." "The tomatoes," Thistle announced from somewhere near Aveline's left ankle, "are not the only ones." Aldous looked down at the fox. The fox looked up at Aldous. A full second passed. "Has she always been like this?" he asked Aveline. "I met her 40 minutes ago," Aveline said. "And yet," Thistle said pleasantly, "I am already the most interesting thing that has happened to either of you in years." "You're welcome." Inside, the farmhouse was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something cooking that Aveline's stomach responded to before her mind had finished registering it. A single long table, 2 chairs, shelves of preserved jars catching the firelight. A window above the basin looking out at the darkening field. Simple. Solid. The kind of home that had been lived in genuinely, not arranged for appearances. She stood just inside the door for a moment, and something about the room pressed against the inside of her chest in a way she couldn't immediately name. Then she recognized it. It felt like the opposite of the palace. The palace had been enormous and cold and full of things that belonged to the crown. This room was small and warm and full of things that belonged to a person. She hadn't been in a room like this in decades. "Sit," Aldous said, already moving to the fire. "Soup's been on since this morning. It won't be elegant." "I don't need elegant," she said, and meant it more completely than she had meant anything in recent memory. Thistle had already installed herself on the hearthrug with the confidence of an animal who considered all warm floors her personal property. She tucked her nose under her tail, opened one amber eye, and said, "If there's bread, I would like some. I'm not proud. I am, however, hungry." Aldous produced bread without comment. He tore a piece and set it on the hearthrug beside the fox with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had decided that a talking fox was simply a new category of guest, and he was going to be a decent host about it. Thistle looked at the bread, looked at him. "I misjudged you initially," she said. "You may stay." "Generous," he said, and went back to the soup. They ate without ceremony, and Aveline discovered two things. The soup was better than anything that had come out of the palace kitchens in the last decade, and Aldous Fenwick was a man who could be quiet without making silence feel like a demand. He didn't ask her where she had come from. He didn't ask about the trunk or the wrecked carriage, or why a woman of her bearing was heading alone into dead territory at dusk. He passed her the bread, refilled her bowl without asking, and let her be exactly what she was in that moment. A person who needed to eat and breathe and sit still for 5 minutes without anyone wanting something from her. She had forgotten that people like this existed. Thistle, for her part, managed approximately 4 minutes of silence before the pressure became too much. "I should explain a few things," the fox announced, sitting up on the hearthrug with the posture of someone about to deliver a very important lecture. "Should you?" Aveline asked. "Yes. You have questions. I can see them accumulating behind your eyes, and it's making me anxious." Thistle settled her tail around her paws. "The land you're going to, the dying land, is not simply dead. It is waiting. There is a difference. Dead things do not wait. Dead things are finished. This land is not finished. It has been holding its breath for something specific, and that something—" She paused for effect, because Thistle was, among her many qualities, a creature of theater. "Is you." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the field. "Me?" Aveline said flatly. "You." Thistle held her gaze without blinking, which foxes can do for an unsettling amount of time. The Blooming Covenant is old. Older than the Voss Pack, older than the Alpha lines, older than anyone living remembers. It is simply this: when a Luna of true bond is stripped of what is rightfully hers, not lost, not traded, not surrendered, but taken through cowardice and cruelty, the land acknowledges the debt. It chooses her. It gives her somewhere to begin again. The soup in Aveline's bowl had gone slightly cool. She didn't notice. "The land felt it when you were expelled?" Aldous asked. He had set down his spoon and was watching Thistle with the focused attention of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the world. "The land felt it before she even left the hall," Thistle said. "Why do you think nothing grew there for 30 years? It wasn't waiting for rain." She looked at Aveline. It was waiting for her. The silence that followed was the kind that asks to be sat with rather than filled. Aveline looked at her hands around the bowl, the scraped knuckles, the years written into the skin, the hands of a woman who had done everything right for 48 years inside walls that had never once been hers. She thought of the root that had twitched in the dead earth when she laughed on the road, though she hadn't seen it. Only felt something shift in the soles of her feet, like a low, distant note. "What does it want from me?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," Thistle said, and her voice lost its theatrical edge for just a moment, landing somewhere genuine and old. "It doesn't want anything from you. It wants to give to you. That's what makes it different from everywhere you've been." Aveline set her bowl down, pressed her palms flat on the table, breathed. Aldous said nothing. He picked up his spoon again and finished his soup, and the simple normalcy of that gesture, a man, eating his dinner, letting her have the moment she needed, steadied her more than any words could have. "I should leave at first light," she said finally. "The road east is rough past the marker," Aldous said. "I'll take you in the cart. The mare knows that terrain better than Osric's palace horse knew anything." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said simply, and that was the end of that. Thistle made a sound that was approximately a fox's version of a satisfied sigh. "Excellent. I've always wanted to witness a kingdom being born." She resettled on the hearthrug and closed her eyes. "Wake me at dawn. And if anyone lets the fire go out, I will be very vocal about it." Aveline slept that night in Aldous' spare room, on a bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar and clean air, and she slept without dreaming for the first time in longer than she could measure. No palace corridors stretching endlessly in the dark. No sound of Malakar's voice reading dissolution scrolls in empty halls. Just quiet and warmth and the distant sound of the farm dogs settling outside, and somewhere in the house, the faint, reassuring presence of a man who had asked nothing of her and given her dinner anyway. She woke before dawn, as she always did. This time, she didn't press her palms to her dress to flatten the dread. There was no dread. There was something else. Something she turned over carefully in the dark of the spare room, trying to identify it accurately. Not hope exactly. Not yet. Something earlier than hope. The state just before hope, when the body has decided to try again before the mind has fully agreed. She rose, washed her face, went to the window. To the east, the dying land lay flat and gray under the first pale suggestion of morning. From here it looked like nothing, like a held breath, like an absence. But she watched it, and as the light shifted, she thought she saw, or perhaps felt, the distinction wasn't clear, a faint tremor move through the cracked earth, like something stretching, like something beginning to remember what it was made to do. Behind her, from the hallway, Thistle's voice drifted under the door with the timing of a creature who had been awake for some time and was very ready for the day to begin. "The cart is ready, the farmer is already outside, and I have been sitting in this corridor for 20 minutes because someone closed the door and I have very short legs. Could we please—" Aveline opened the door. Thistle walked in, looked around the room, looked at Aveline and said with great dignity, "Thank you." "I wasn't complaining. I was simply providing information." "Of course," Aveline said, and pulled on her coat. The cart rolled east as the sun broke the horizon, painting the dead land gold for the first time in 30 years, and beneath its surface, answering the light and the woman moving toward it, roots that had been still for 3 decades uncurled slowly in the dark soil, reaching toward something they recognized. Above the cart, unseen by any of them, a single bird landed on the border stone, then another, then 12 more. They sat in a row and watched Aveline Crow move toward the land that had been waiting for her, and not one of them made a sound, because some arrivals are too important for noise. Back in the Voss Palace, 3 hours west, Malakar sat at the head of the breakfast table and told himself he felt nothing. He was very convincing. He had been practicing for 48 years. It was Vera who noticed first, the way the roses in the eastern courtyard had begun to drop their petals overnight. Every single bloom, all at once, as though something had recalled them from a distance. She didn't mention it to Malakar. Some things, she was learning, were better observed quietly. To the east, the dying land exhaled for the first time in a generation, And where Aveline's boots touched the cracked gray earth as she stepped down from the cart, a single green shoot split the ground and reached, trembling and improbable and absolutely certain, toward the morning sky. The first thing Embervale grew was a mushroom the size of Thistle's head, and Thistle took it personally. "That," the fox announced, circling it with her tail bristled, "is aggressive. We've been here 4 hours and the land is already overcompensating." She sniffed it, recoiled. "It smells like ambition." "It smells like earth," Aveline said, already on her knees 10 feet away, pressing both palms flat against the cracked ground the way she had done instinctively the moment she stepped off the cart. And the moment she did, the soil beneath her hands had gone warm. Not sun-warm. Alive warm. Like pressing your palm to someone's chest and feeling a heartbeat you didn't expect. "Don't touch everything," Thistle warned. "I'm not touching. I'm listening." "With your hands." "Yes." Thistle looked at Aldous. Aldous looked at Thistle. A full second of silent agreement passed between them. The universal language of two people watching someone extraordinary do something neither of them can explain, and deciding not to interfere. What happened next happened fast. Faster than any of them were prepared for, and Aveline had the distinct impression that the land had been holding everything back for a very long time and had simply been waiting for permission. The mushroom was followed by grass. Not patchy, struggling grass, but a full carpet of it, rolling outward from where her knees touched the ground like a green tide being pushed by an invisible hand. Then wildflowers. Then a stand of young birch trees that had absolutely no business being 6 feet tall by mid-afternoon but were anyway. Then water. A spring that split the earth 30 yards to the north with a sound like a held breath finally released, clear and cold and immediate, cutting a channel through the gray soil that went dark and rich the moment the water touched it. Aveline stood in the middle of all of it with her arms slightly out from her sides and her face turned toward the sky, and the wind that moved through the new grass smelled like rain and green things and something older beneath that. Something that had no name in any language she knew, but that her body recognized completely, the way it recognizes a song heard in childhood that the mind has forgotten, but the chest has not. Aldous stood at the edge of the spreading green and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. He had farmed land his entire life. He had turned soil and coaxed seeds and fought drought and frost and the particular cruelty of weather that doesn't care about effort. He understood what land cost. He had never seen land give. "Well," Thistle said from directly behind him, loudly enough to break the silence like a dropped pot. "That's going to attract attention." She was right. By the second morning, they had their first visitor. He arrived on foot, a man of perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, carrying everything he owned in a pack on his back, with the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had been moving for a long time and had learned to assess each new place quickly. He stopped at what had been the border of the dead land the day before, and was now, unmistakably, a meadow. And he looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Aveline, who was directing Aldous on where to dig a second channel from the spring because the water was already trying to go that direction anyway, and she believed in working with the land rather than against it. "Is this yours?" the man asked. "It's becoming," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He set his pack down, rolled up his sleeves. "What needs doing?" His name was Bren, and he had left the Voss Kingdom's eastern villages 3 years ago, when Malakar's tax collectors had taken everything, including the seed grain, and he had been walking ever since looking for somewhere that felt like it might hold. He was followed that same afternoon by a young woman named Sable, who had heard the spring from 2 miles away, and followed the sound of water the way desperate people always follow water, absolutely and without hesitation. By the end of the 3rd day, there were 11 people camped on the new grass of Embervale, each of them arriving with the same expression. The face of someone who has been carrying too much for too long and has just been told they can put it down. Aveline fed them all from the spring water and the food Aldous brought daily from his farm. He made the 2-mile trip every morning without being asked, arriving at the same hour with the cart loaded, which Aveline noted and said nothing about, and which Thistle noted and said entirely too much about at every available opportunity. "He likes you," the fox announced one evening, as Aveline and Aldous sat on opposite sides of the fire going over what materials would be needed to build something more permanent than canvas. "He's being helpful," Aveline said. "He drove 2 miles in the cold this morning to bring you rosemary because you mentioned yesterday that you missed the smell of it," Thistle said. "That is not helpful. That is devoted." Aldous kept his eyes on the notes he was making and said nothing, but the back of his neck went the particular color of a man who has been seen clearly and isn't sure whether to be embarrassed or grateful. "Thistle," Aveline said. "I'm simply providing information," the fox said, "as is my function." On the 4th day, the wolves arrived. Not shifters, actual wolves, 4 of them, appearing at the northern edge of the meadow in the blue hour before dawn, when the mist still sat low over the new grass. Aveline was already awake when she heard them. She was always awake before the sun, 48 years of habit. And she stepped out of the tent Aldous had built her and stood very still and looked at them across the meadow. The largest one, gray, enormous, with a scar running the length of his left shoulder, looked back at her without aggression, without fear, with something that in a person's face would have been called recognition. She held out her hand. Every person who heard about this moment later refused to entirely believe it, but Bren was awake and saw it from his bedroll, and he swore to it until the end of his days. The gray wolf crossed the meadow without hesitation, placed his enormous head under Aveline Crow's outstretched hand, and closed his eyes. The other 3 followed. By the time the camp woke, there were 4 wolves sleeping in a loose circle around the outside of Aveline's tent, and Thistle was sitting on top of the largest one eating a piece of bread and looking extraordinarily pleased with herself. "I had nothing to do with this," she announced, to no one in particular. "This was entirely the land's decision. I merely suggested the direction." The gray wolf opened one eye, looked at the fox on his back, and closed it again with the patience of a very large creature that has made its peace with the situation. 300 miles west, in the Voss Palace, Malakar's best tracker returned from a 2-day ride east and asked for a private audience. Malakar received him in the war room. No, not the war room, the strategy room. He'd taken to calling it that, a small revision that bothered him less. And the tracker stood before him and reported what he had seen in the dying lands with the careful, flat voice of a professional delivering news he knows his employer will not want to hear. Greenland, a spring, people coming from every direction, 4 wolves lying peaceful as dogs around the tent of a silver-haired woman who moved through the new meadow as though the ground was listening to her footsteps. Malakar said nothing for a long time. "How many people?" he asked. 11 when I left. More arriving." The tracker paused. "There's talk, my king, in the villages. They're calling her..." Another pause, shorter, the kind a man makes when he's deciding how to say something. "They're calling her the Blooming Queen." The fire in the strategy room popped and settled. Malakar stood, walked to the window, looked east. At the horizon he couldn't see anything beyond, but that he was now, for the first time, thinking about very carefully. He had expelled her with nothing. No title, no funds, no escort, no future. He had handed her a cracked carriage and a direction and closed the door. And she had walked into dead land and made it breathe. "Send me everything," he said quietly. "Every report, every name. Every person who camps on that land." He didn't turn from the window. "I want to know exactly what she's building." The tracker left without another word, and Malakar stood at his window and felt, for the first time in 48 years, something he had never once felt in relation to Aveline Crow. Afraid. Back in Embervale, because it was already Embervale now, Thistle had named it on day 2 with the confidence of someone who considers naming things part of her official responsibilities. Aveline stood at the edge of the spring as the sun set and watched the water run clear over stones that hadn't been wet in 30 years. Aldous came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him on her left side, and together they watched the new land go gold in the evening light. "It's going to keep growing," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "That's going to cause problems." "Also yes." A pause. The water ran. A bird she didn't recognize sang once from the birch trees and fell quiet. "Are you afraid?" he asked, and his voice was low enough that it was clearly only for her. She considered the question honestly, the way she was beginning to allow herself to consider things, without first checking whether the answer was acceptable, without editing herself before she spoke. "I was afraid in that palace every day for 48 years, she said. "Afraid to be too much, afraid to be not enough, afraid to be seen wanting something." She looked at the water, at the green spread of the meadow, at the wolves sleeping in the distance. "I don't feel afraid here. I feel—" She paused, searching. "Awake." Aldous looked at her for a moment, with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. He said it. "Good," he said simply. "You should have been awake a long time ago." From 10 feet behind them, without any pretense of not having heard every word, Thistle said, "I am giving this moment a 9 out of 10. Point deducted for nobody holding hands. Remedied immediately, please." Aveline laughed. Aldous laughed. The wolves stirred at the sound of it, and the land, as if it agreed, pushed 3 new wildflowers up through the soil right at the water's edge, red and gold and stubborn as everything Aveline Crow had ever refused to let die. But 300 miles west, a king had just discovered that the woman he had thrown away was building something he couldn't control, and Malachar had never in his life left something he couldn't control alone. By the 8th day, Embervale had a population problem. Not the bad kind. The kind where you run out of space to put people who keep arriving with hopeful eyes and everything they own strapped to their backs. Aveline had woken that morning to find 6 new tents had appeared overnight on the eastern meadow. A family of 5 had constructed something that was either a very ambitious lean-to or the beginning of an actual building, and a woman named Dorcia had simply started a market stall between 2 birch trees, selling preserved goods from a basket, because, as she explained to Aveline with complete pragmatic calm, where people gather, someone has to sell cheese. Thistle found the cheese stall immediately. This surprised no one. "You can't just take it," Aveline told her. "I'm not taking it. I'm sampling. There's a difference." Thistle had a piece of hard yellow cheese the size of her paw and 0 remorse. "Also, I'm providing a service. My presence raises the property value of any location I choose to occupy." Dorcia, for her part, looked down at the fox eating her product and said simply, "Does she talk to everyone or just—" "Everyone," Aveline and Aldous said simultaneously. Dorcia nodded, cut another piece of cheese, and set it deliberately on the edge of her table. "Market's open," she said. Thistle looked at the cheese, looked at Dorcia. "I like her," she announced. "She stays." The problem, the actual problem, beneath the beautiful chaos of a place becoming real, was that Aveline had no framework for what was happening. She had spent 48 years being a Luna inside a structure that already existed, following rules that had been written before she arrived, and would remain after she left. She knew how to function within architecture. She had never been asked to be the architecture itself. It was Aldous who noticed her standing at the edge of the camp that afternoon, very still, watching the activity with an expression he had learned to read in the past week. Not distress, but the particular stillness of a woman processing something too large to hold all at once. He came to stand beside her and handed her a cup of tea without preamble. She took it. "There are 43 people here," she said. 46. 3 more arrived while you were at the spring. They need shelter. Real shelter before the cold comes. She wrapped both hands around the cup. They need a system for the water. They need Aldous. They need a council. They need someone to make decisions and... They have someone, he said. She looked at him. They followed you here, he said simply. Not the land, not the spring. They came because word travels, and the word was, there is a woman in the east who walked into dead ground and made it green, and she is building something that doesn't belong to anyone who'll take it from you. He let that land. That's you, Aveline. That's already you. She looked out at the camp, at Bren directing the water channel construction, at Sable organizing the new arrivals, at the gray wolf patrolling the northern perimeter with the focused authority of a creature that had elected itself to the position, at Thistle holding court at the cheese stall with an audience of 3 increasingly charmed children who had arrived with their parents that morning. I don't know how to build a kingdom, she said quietly. Nobody does, Aldous said. They just start with the thing that needs doing today. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the thing that needs doing today is timber. If I'm going to ask people to winter here, they need walls. My forest has timber, he said. I'll start cutting tomorrow. But she turned to look at him. This man who drove 2 miles every morning with a cart full of supplies and asked nothing in return, who stood beside her in every practical crisis with the steady competence of someone who had decided she was worth showing up for and was not going to revisit that decision. You have your own farm, she said. Your own land. You don't have to... I know, he said. Same as before. And then, because apparently today was a day for saying things he'd been holding quietly, my farm is 2 miles from something extraordinary. I'd rather be part of it than watch it from a distance. From the cheese stall, without any pretense of minding her own business. 9.5, Thistle called out. Half point deducted because he's still not holding your hand. Aldous. The hand. It's right there. Aveline closed her eyes briefly. Aldous looked at the middle distance. His neck did the thing again. She's going to do that every time, he said. Indefinitely, Aveline confirmed. What nobody in Embervale knew, what even Thistle's ancient network of forces older than memory had not yet reported, was that Malakar's first move had already left the palace. His name was Davin, and he was not a tracker this time. Trackers observed. Davin was something else. A man who arrived in places and made things difficult in ways that were hard to trace back to the person who sent him. He was good at finding the weakest point in any new structure and pressing on it, quietly, until it cracked. He entered Embervale on the 9th day dressed as a refugee, pack on his back, story prepared, driven out of the northern territories, heard about the green land, just looking for somewhere to start again. It was a good story. It was the same story as everyone else's, which was exactly the point. He found the weakest point by the end of his first hour. It wasn't the water system, which was primitive but functional. It wasn't the shelter situation, which was chaotic but improving. It wasn't even the question of leadership, which hung over the camp with a gentle, unresolved weight. It was the people who had arrived in the last 2 days, people from Malakar's own outer territories, people who recognized Aveline Crow as the Voss Luna, and were beginning, quietly, to ask a question that Davin could hear forming in the camp like weather. If she was their Luna, was she still? Did dissolution end a bond to a king or to a people? It was the perfect crack. Davin could work with that. He began carefully and immediately to press. Aveline felt it before she understood it, a shift in the camp's emotional weather, subtle as a change in wind direction. 3 conversations she walked into that day ended too quickly. A group near the water channel went quiet when she approached in a way that was different from the respectful quiet she'd grown used to. A man she hadn't met before was talking in a low, urgent voice to Bren, and Bren's face had the look of someone being told something he wasn't sure what to do with. She said nothing yet. She watched. Thistle watched, too, from her position on the gray wolf's back, which had become her preferred mode of transport around camp, because, as she had explained, short legs were a design flaw she refused to accommodate any longer. The wolf bore this with dignity. "New arrival," the fox said quietly, appearing at Aveline's side that evening with none of her usual fanfare, which itself was information. "Brown coat. Came in this morning. He's been talking to anyone who will listen." "About what?" "About you." Thistle's amber eyes were steady. "About whether a dissolved Luna has any right to claim territory. About whether what you're building here is yours, or whether it belongs to the Voss line by ancient pack law." A pause. He's not asking because he's curious. Aveline looked across the camp to where the fire was burning and people were gathering for the evening meal, the way they had started doing naturally, without anyone organizing it. Just the human impulse toward warmth and company, and the comfort of eating together. 46 people who had come here because they needed somewhere that wouldn't take things from them. She felt something sharpen behind her sternum. Not anger. Something older and quieter than anger. The knowledge of what was being attempted, and the absolute refusal to allow it. "Which one is he?" she asked. Thistle nodded toward the fire. Brown coat, mid-40s, talking to a family who had arrived yesterday, his posture friendly and his eyes doing something that didn't match it. Aveline set down the water vessel in her hands, straightened, walked toward the fire with the same spine she had carried into the great hall 11 days ago, level, unhurried, the walk of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do and finds no drama in doing it. She sat directly across the fire from Davin, which forced him to look at her and said pleasantly, "I don't think we've met. I'm Aveline. This is my land. Tell me about yourself." The fire popped between them. Davin smiled with all of his face except his eyes. "Just a traveler," he said. "Grateful for the shelter." "Travelers are always welcome here," she said, holding his gaze with the calm of a woman who had spent 48 years reading rooms that were trying to destroy her and had become very, very good at it. "As long as they're building something and not dismantling it." The family beside them had gone very still and very attentive. Davin said nothing. "I'll have Bren find you something useful to do in the morning," she said cheerfully, standing. "We're cutting timber tomorrow. It's hard work." She smiled at him, the same quiet, knowing smile she had turned on Malachar in the Great Hall. "I look forward to getting to know you better." She walked back to where Aldous was standing at the edge of the firelight, having watched all of it. "Malachar's?" he asked quietly. "Malachar's," she confirmed. Behind them, loud enough to be heard by everyone within 8 feet of the fire, Thistle announced from atop the gray wolf, "For the record, I identified him within 4 minutes of arrival. I simply allowed her the satisfaction of handling it herself. You're all very welcome." The timber operation started badly, improved dramatically, and ended with Thistle stuck in a tree for 40 minutes, which she later maintained was a tactical choice. Aldous had brought 2 of his farmhands, brothers named Cole and Pell, who were large and quiet and competent in the specific way of men who have spent their lives solving physical problems. And by mid-morning, the first real framework of Embervale's first permanent structure was beginning to take shape on the flat ground north of the spring. Not a palace, not a hall, a long, low building with enough roof to shelter 30 people from rain, because that was what was needed. And Aveline had spent 48 years learning the difference between what looks impressive and what actually keeps people warm. Davin, now equipped with an axe and a work assignment that kept him visible and busy, had spent the morning chopping with the focused energy of a man who was recalculating his approach. Aveline noted this without appearing to. She had stationed Bren nearby for reasons she described as coordination, and that everyone understood perfectly. "You're managing him," Aldous said, passing her a water flask at midday. "I'm giving him the opportunity to be useful," she said. "If he takes it, perhaps he remembers why he came here. If he doesn't," she shrugged, "then I know exactly what he is." Aldous looked at her with that expression again. She was getting better at not looking away from it. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just—" He stopped, started again. "For 48 years you were in a palace that didn't see you clearly. I'm finding it—" Another stop. The man had the vocabulary and kept choosing not to use all of it, which she was beginning to find both frustrating and endearing in equal measure. "You're finding it what?" she pressed. He looked at her for a long, direct moment. "Remarkable," he said finally, quietly. "Watching someone come into their own. It's remarkable." The word landed somewhere it had no business landing, low and warm and unexpected, and she felt the back of her neck go the particular temperature of a woman who has been seen in a way she didn't prepare for. From directly above them, because Thistle had climbed a nearby oak for the elevation and the commentary opportunities it provided. 10 out of 10, he said, remarkable. "Aldous, follow it up immediately." "Thistle," they both said. "I'm simply providing information," Aveline said. "Yes, thank you." "You're both impossible," the fox muttered and retreated further into the oak. A branch cracked, a pause. Then, with immense dignity, "I am fine. This is fine. I chose this." It was Sable who brought the news at mid-afternoon, arriving from the eastern perimeter at a pace that made Aveline set down what she was doing before Sable had said a word. "Riders," Sable said, catching her breath. 6 of them, Voss colors. They stopped at the border marker and they're not coming in. They're just standing there, watching. The camp went quiet in the spreading way that camps go quiet when something threatening arrives. Person by person, task by task, until the silence has reached every corner and everyone is looking at the same point. 6 Voss riders at the border, not entering, just watching. A message then, not a raid. Malachar was reminding her that he could see her, that he was paying attention, that whatever she was building here existed within the long sight of a king who had not finished with her. Aveline walked to the eastern perimeter. Aldous walked with her. Thistle, who had extracted herself from the oak with great dignity and minimal commentary about the experience, trotted ahead. The 6 riders were exactly as Sable had described, mounted still in Voss crimson, positioned just beyond the last border stone, with the deliberate placement of a statement rather than a greeting. The lead rider held no weapon. He held a scroll. Aveline stopped 10 feet from the border, looked at the riders. The riders looked at her. "You have something to deliver," she said. "Deliver it." The lead rider walked his horse forward, leaned down, and held out the scroll. She took it. He pulled back immediately, which told her his instructions had been precise. Deliver, do not engage, return. She broke the seal. She read it once. The same way she had read the summons scroll 11 days ago, completely, without flinching. Then she folded it, placed it in her coat pocket, and looked at the riders. "Tell him," she said clearly, "that I received it." The riders left at a canter. She watched them until they were gone. Aldous waited. The camp waited. Even Thistle, in an extraordinary act of self-restraint, waited. Aveline turned back toward Embervale, toward the timber frame of the shelter going up, toward the spring running clear, toward 46 people who had stopped what they were doing and were watching her with the focused attention of people whose futures have just become contingent on what happens next. She pulled the scroll from her pocket and held it up. "Malachar has formally declared these lands Voss territory under ancient pack annexation law," she said, her voice carrying easily across the quiet camp. "He's given us 30 days to vacate." Silence. Then Bren said, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, with the flat certainty of a man who had already lost everything once to this king and was not going to do it again. "And?" Aveline looked at the scroll, at the Voss seal, at the formal language of a man who had spent 48 years believing that paper and authority were the same thing. She tore it in half, then in half again, let the pieces fall. "And we keep building," she said. The cheer that went up from 46 people hit the new birch trees and scattered birds from the branches in a bright, startled cloud, and the gray wolf raised his head and howled once, long and clear and carrying, and somewhere beneath the roots of Embervale, the land shook with something that felt, to anyone paying attention with their feet, very much like laughter. Thistle sat in the middle of all of it with her tail around her paws, and her amber eyes bright, and said to no one in particular, with enormous satisfaction, 30 days. Adorable. He has no idea. That night, after the camp had settled and the fire had gone low, Aveline sat outside her tent and looked at the stars over Embervale. More stars than she had ever seen from the palace, unobstructed by towers and walls and all the architecture of a life that hadn't been hers. Aldous sat beside her, not too close, close enough. They didn't speak for a long time, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. "He's going to send more than riders next time," she said eventually. "Yes," Aldous agreed. "We're not ready." "No," a pause. "But we will be." She looked at him, the firelight, the silver at his temples, the hands resting on his knees, those large, scarred, honest hands that had pulled her out of a wrecked carriage and kept showing up every morning since, with rosemary and timber and the specific unshowy devotion of a man who expressed everything through what he did, rather than what he said. She was aware, in the way you become aware of a sound that has been present for some time, that she was in trouble. The good kind. The terrifying kind. The kind she had not expected to find at 68 on the edges of a kingdom she was building from nothing, and that was arriving anyway with the same unstoppable certainty as the wildflowers and the spring and the wolves. She looked back at the stars before he could read it on her face. Aldous looked back at the stars too, and if he had read it anyway, he was, as in all things, patient enough to let her arrive there in her own time. From inside the tent, muffled by canvas but entirely audible, "I can hear both of you not saying things and it is genuinely painful. Good night. Say something. Good night." Aveline smiled at the stars. "Good night, Thistle," she said. A pause. Then, resigned and fond in equal measure, "Good night, Aveline." 300 miles west, Malachar received the report that his scroll had been torn in pieces before 46 witnesses, and he sat for a very long time with his hands flat on the war room table. Strategy room, he corrected himself. Strategy room. And understood for the first time that expelling Aveline Crow had not ended anything. It had started something, and he was already behind. On the 14th day of Embervale, 3 things happened simultaneously, which Thistle later described as cosmically inefficient scheduling. A delegation of 6 Voss legal representatives arrived at the border with documents, formal seals, and the specific energy of men who believed that paperwork was a form of weapon. A herd of 14 deer walked calmly out of the dead zone to the south and installed themselves in the eastern meadow as though they had a reservation. And Aldous Fenwick, in the middle of hauling timber, put his back out. "I'm fine," he said immediately, from a position that suggested the opposite. "You are horizontal," Aveline said. "Strategically horizontal," Thistle offered. "Conserving energy." "I tripped," Aldous said with great dignity from the ground. Cole and Pell, the farmhand brothers, had the particular expressionless faces of men who had made a mutual agreement to never speak of this. They set down their timber and looked at the sky. The sky was neutral on the matter. "The delegation is waiting," Bren said, appearing at Aveline's shoulder and nodding toward the border. Aveline looked at Aldous on the ground, looked at the legal delegation at the border, looked at 14 deer grazing peacefully in her meadow as though nothing political was happening anywhere nearby. "Help him up," she told Call. To Aldous, "Don't lift anything until it stops hurting." To Bren, "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." To the deer, nothing, because they were deer and they were already home, and that was enough. Thistle fell into step beside her as she walked toward the border. "I should warn you," the fox said. The lead representative is a man named Oswald. He has 17 documents. I counted from a distance. He is the kind of man who believes that having more paper than the other person constitutes a legal victory. How do you know his name? The Grey Wolf has excellent hearing, and I have an excellent arrangement with the Grey Wolf. Oswald was everything Thistle had described. Compact, precise, carrying a leather satchel that appeared to be struggling under the weight of its own contents, with the expression of a man who had won many arguments in closed rooms and expected this to be another one. He introduced himself formally, cited 3 separate Voss legal precedents before Aveline had said a word, and then produced the first document with the flourish of someone who considers paper unfolding a performance art. Under the Voss Territorial Consolidation Act, any uninhabited land within 200 miles of the Voss seat of power falls under automatic crown claim upon settlement by parties without independent pact standing, he said. As a dissolved Luna, you hold no independent pact standing. Therefore, I hold Blooming Covenant standing, Aveline said. Oswald stopped. Behind him, 2 of his colleagues exchanged a look. The third one wrote something down, which was interesting. The Blooming Covenant, Oswald said carefully, is not recognized within Voss jurisdictional. The Blooming Covenant predates Voss jurisdiction by approximately 400 years, Aveline said pleasantly. It predates the Voss Pact itself. It predates, I'd wager, most of the documents in that bag. She nodded at the satchel. Which particular consolidation act would you like to compare it to first? Oswald's mouth opened, closed. He looked at his colleagues. One of them, the one who had been writing, was now writing much faster. I'll need to consult with... Of course, Aveline said. Consult as long as you need. In the meantime... She gestured behind her at Embervale, at the timber frame now fully roofed, at the spring, at the deer in the meadow, at the 63 people who had arrived by that morning and were going about their day with the productive calm of people who have decided they are staying. We'll keep building. Oswald looked at all of it, at the scale of it, at the deer, at the 4 wolves now sitting in a neat row at the perimeter, like a welcoming committee that had not been briefed on how welcoming worked. At Thistle, sitting directly behind Aveline's left boot, staring at him with amber eyes that held the specific intensity of a creature that has made a comprehensive character assessment and reached conclusions. Is that a fox? He asked, thrown entirely off his script. That is Thistle, Aveline said. She is my advisor. I prefer chief counsel, Thistle said. But we haven't formalized the title yet. It's on the agenda. Oswald stared at the fox for a long moment. Then he closed his document, replaced it carefully in the satchel, and said with the strained professionalism of a man holding his composure together with both hands, We will return with a response within 10 days. We'll be here, Aveline said. The delegation left. The colleague who had been writing so furiously was now the one walking fastest, which Aveline noted with interest. She turned back to camp. You don't actually have formal covenant documentation, Bren said, falling into step beside her. No, she agreed. So, if they come back with a counter-argument, they won't, Thistle said confidently. The one who was writing is going to go directly to the Ancient Records Archive and discover that everything she said is accurate. And then he is going to have a very difficult conversation with Malachar. A satisfied pause. I have been waiting 14 days to deploy the covenant argument. Timing is everything. Bren looked at the fox. Did you know they were coming? I had a feeling, Thistle said, with the serene tone of someone who absolutely knew and chose not to mention it. I find that surprise motivates people to their best performance. You're welcome. Aldous was upright by mid-afternoon, moving carefully, pretending his back was fine with the determination of a man who finds being incapacitated personally offensive. Aveline found him attempting to carry a single plank of timber with the casual energy of someone demonstrating that nothing was wrong. Put it down, she said. I'm... Aldous. He put it down. She sat on the timber pile beside him because she needed a moment too. The legal delegation, the deer, 63 people, the constant hum of a place becoming real. And he sat beside her, and they were quiet together, the way they had become good at. "He's escalating," she said. "Legal pressure means the riders didn't work. Next will be something bigger." "How much time do we have before 30 days is up?" 16 days. She looked at the shelter. Full last night for the first time, 31 people under the roof Aldous had built. "We need the second structure finished. We need the water channel extended east. We need—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat on her thighs. "We need more than 16 days. Then we use what we have," he said. "Same as every day." She looked at him sideways. "Does anything alarm you?" He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. He never gave her the easy answer just to give her something. "Plenty of things alarm me," he said. "I just don't find it useful to be alarmed before the thing actually arrives." He looked at her. "Does that bother you?" "No," she said, and meant it completely. "It's the most restful thing about you." Something shifted in his face, quiet and private, there and then managed, and he looked back at the camp. "Restful," he said, in the tone of a man filing the word away to consider later in private. From the roof of the completed shelter, where Thistle had taken up a supervisory position, she said restful and meant extraordinary. "I will translate going forward, free of charge." "Please don't," Aveline said. "Already doing it," Thistle said cheerfully. The animals came that night. Not just the deer, not just the wolves, something larger, something that began around midnight as a rustling at the perimeter and by dawn had become unmistakable. Aveline woke to birdsong so dense it sounded like weather, stepped out of her tent, and found the meadow transformed. Foxes. Thistle's kind, and Thistle's reaction to this was complicated, oscillating between territorial offense and reluctant pride. Rabbits in numbers that defied reasonable expectation. 2 enormous elk standing at the northern edge with the calm authority of creatures that have decided to relocate their entire lives based on a feeling in their feet. And birds everywhere, in the birch trees, on the shelter roof, on the wolves, who had developed a policy of dignified tolerance regarding birds that Aveline found quietly hilarious. And in the middle of it all, walking in from the south with mud on his boots and wonder on his face, was a young man she had never seen before. 17 or 18, slight, with the startled look of someone who had been walking for a very long time and had just arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. He stopped when he saw her, looked around at the animals, the green meadow, the smoke from the breakfast fire, the timber structure, the spring. Then back at her. "Is this real?" he asked, the way people ask when they've stopped trusting their own eyes. "Yes," she said. He sat down directly where he was standing, in the middle of the path, with the abrupt quality of legs that have made a decision without consulting the rest of the body. "I've been walking for 3 weeks," he said, "from the northern Voss territories. I wasn't sure it was real. I didn't know where else to go." She walked to where he was sitting, crouched down to be level with him, the way she had learned to do with people arriving at Embervale, meeting them where they were, because most of them had come from somewhere that made them feel very small, and the first thing they needed was to be looked at directly. "What's your name?" she asked. "Finn," he said. "Finn." She held out her hand. "Welcome to Embervale. There's breakfast, there's water, and there's work if you want it. Nobody here will take anything from you." He looked at her hand, then took it, and she pulled him to his feet, and something in his face went from watchful to open in the way of a door that has been shut for a long time being given permission to move. Behind her, Thistle appeared at her ankle, looked up at Finn. Finn looked down at Thistle. "She talks," Aveline said preemptively. "I do," Thistle confirmed. "And I have opinions about your boots. They need resoling. We'll discuss it later." "Come eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal since before the northern drought. Finn stared at the fox for a full 3 seconds. Then, helplessly, Okay. Excellent, Thistle said. I find immediate compliance very refreshing. You're going to fit in perfectly. On the 18th day, Malachar stopped sending paper. He sent Corvain instead. Corvain was not a lawyer, not a tracker, not a man who worked through documents or subtlety or the slow pressure of legal argument. He was Malachar's enforcer, a name spoken in the Voss Kingdom's outer territories, with the specific quiet of people who have learned that some names are safer not said too loudly. He traveled with 8 men, and they did not wear the formal Voss crimson. They wore gray, which meant they were not official, which meant Malachar had decided that what happened next should not be traceable to the crown. Aveline knew who he was before he reached the border, because Finn, who had spent 3 weeks in the Northern Territories and had excellent reasons to recognize Corvain on sight, had come to her at first light with the expression of someone delivering the worst kind of news. She had listened, thanked him, and then walked calmly to the eastern perimeter to watch the gray-clad riders approach with the focused attention of a woman deciding exactly what she was going to do. Aldous arrived at her shoulder 30 seconds later, which meant either Finn had told him to, or he had developed the specific instinct of a man who knows when she is standing somewhere toward trouble and feels an unignorable need to be there. 8 of them, he said quietly. 9, she said. There's one in the tree line to the north. He's been there since before dawn. Aldous looked north. How did you... The wolves haven't slept, she said. They've been tracking him since midnight. A beat. Right, he said. Corvain pulled up at the border and looked at Embervale with the professional assessment of a man cataloging vulnerabilities. He looked at the timber structures, the spring, the 71 people who had stopped what they were doing and were watching him with the collective alertness of a community that had learned, mostly from where they'd come from, to read approaching danger quickly. He looked at Aveline. You're to come with us, he said. No preamble, no documents. Voluntarily, or he let the alternative exist in the air without naming it, because men like Corvain understood that unspoken threats have a larger surface area than spoken ones. On whose authority? She asked. The Alpha King's. The Alpha King dissolved all legal bond to me 18 days ago, she said. He documented it himself, before 200 witnesses. She let that sit for a moment. He has no authority over me, or this land, or these people. Corvain smiled. Not warmly. The law says otherwise. The Blooming Covenant says otherwise, she replied. And it was here considerably longer than the law. From somewhere behind her, she was aware of the camp moving, not away, but toward. Bren to her left, Sable to her right, Finn somewhere behind her, which surprised her because he had no reason to stand in this line, except that he had been here 9 days and had apparently decided that was enough. Call and Pell flanking wide, and the gray wolf walking forward to stand directly beside her with the absolute physical authority of a creature that weighs more than 3 men and has decided where it belongs. Corvain looked at the wolf, at the 71 people, at Aveline, who had not moved or raised her voice or shown one visible degree of fear. You have until tomorrow morning, he said, and it came out slightly less certain than it had arrived, which everyone present noticed. Or we come in. You're welcome to try, Aveline said. But I'd spend the evening thinking carefully about who you're actually working for and what it's going to cost you personally when this is finished. A pause. Because it will be finished. And I remember the faces of everyone who stood on the wrong side of it. Corvain held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and pulled back with his men to the tree line. Not gone, just waiting, which was its own kind of message. The camp exhaled collectively. Aveline turned back to face her people, and they were her people. She understood that fully now, no longer a question, simply a fact. and said with complete calm, "Bren, I need the water channel finished today. Cull, Pell. The second structure needs its east wall before tonight. Sable, I need a full count of everyone here and their particular skills, because we're going to need all of them." She looked at Finn. "Can you ride?" "Yes," he said immediately. "I need a rider to go west tonight, not toward Voss, toward the Free Territories. There are independent pack elders there who have no love for Malakar's expansion. Ride fast. Tell them the Blooming Covenant has activated and there is a queen in Embervale who would very much appreciate a conversation." Finn's chin came up with the particular lift of a young person who has just been given something important to do. "I'll leave it dark," he said. She nodded, looked at all of them, at the faces of people who had arrived broken and were becoming something else here, daily, under this sky, in this green land that had chosen her. "He's not coming in tomorrow morning," she said clearly, "because he knows that what's here now cannot be quietly dissolved. He'll go back to Malakar and report that, and then Malakar will make a bigger mistake." She looked at each face. "When he does, we'll be ready." That evening, after the east wall was up, and Finn had ridden west, and the wolves were at the perimeter, and the camp was fed, and as settled as a camp could be with 9 gray-clad men waiting in the dark tree line, Aldous found Aveline at the spring. She was sitting at the water's edge with her boots off and her feet in the cold current, looking at the sky, and she looked so completely exhausted and so completely unwilling to admit it that something in his chest turned over quietly. He sat beside her, took his own boots off, put his feet in the water, which was extremely cold, and did not react, because she was looking at the sky, and this was clearly a moment for solidarity rather than reasonable decisions about water temperature. She felt him not react to the cold and looked at him. "It's freezing," she said. "It's fine," he said, with the face of a man whose feet were regretting this entirely. She laughed, that short, real laugh that she still seemed surprised by each time it arrived. He loved that laugh. He was aware that he had been cataloging things he loved about her for 18 days, and that the list had become extensive, and that at some point he was going to have to do something about that. "Aldous," she said, and something in her voice had shifted. Quieter, the voice she used when she wasn't performing steadiness for the benefit of anyone watching. "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," he said. "If it does, Aveline." He turned to look at her directly, which he'd learned was the only way to interrupt a thought she'd decided to finish. "You walked into dead land at 68 years old with one trunk and a cracked wheel carriage and made it green. You tore a royal decree in front of 70 witnesses and they cheered. You just faced down a man who has made entire villages afraid to say his name, and you did it in bare feet." He glanced down at her feet in the spring, then back up. "Metaphorically, you haven't been wrong yet about a single thing. I'm not concerned." She looked at him. The firelight from camp reached them faintly. Enough. "You're always so certain," she said quietly. Not a complaint. Something closer to wonder. "I'm certain about a few specific things," he said. "You're one of them." The spring ran between their feet. The camp murmured behind them. Somewhere in the dark, Thistle was almost certainly listening, and in an act of grace that Aveline would never forget, and that Thistle would later describe as a deliberate strategic pause in my advisory services. The fox said absolutely nothing. Aveline looked at the water, at the green bank of Embervale stretching away in the dark, at the stars coming through, clear and enormous and indifferent to kings. Then she reached over and placed her hand over his where it rested on the grass between them. He turned his hand over, held hers, said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. From the dark. 10, Thistle whispered, barely audible to herself and the night and no one else. Finally, 10. The next morning, Corvain was gone. All 9 of them, including the one in the tree line. Gone before dawn, no message, no final warning, just the pressed flat grass where horses had stood all night, and the silence of men who had looked at what Embervale had become and decided the report they were going to deliver to Malachar was not one they wanted to be near when he received it. Aveline stood at the border and looked at the empty tree line and understood exactly what it meant. Malachar had just run out of quiet options. Whatever came next would not be quiet. But standing in the early morning light of a land that had been dead for 30 years and was now green and loud with birdsong and the sound of 71 people waking up and starting fires and calling each other's names, she found, to her own mild astonishment, that she was ready. Thistle appeared at her ankle, looked at the empty tree line and said, with the satisfied gravity of a very old fox who has seen many things and knows how stories go, "He's going to come himself next time." "I know," Aveline said. "Good." A pause. "Wear something impressive. Presentation matters." Aveline looked down at the fox. "Thistle. I'm just saying, you're a queen. Dress like one." Behind them, Embervale woke into its 18th morning, green and stubborn and entirely magnificently alive. 300 miles west, Malachar received Corvain's report in silence, dismissed everyone from the room, and sat alone with the knowledge that the woman he had thrown away with nothing had built something that 9 trained men had looked at and walked away from. He stood, straightened his alpha chain. If he wanted this finished, he was going to have to finish it himself. Malachar rode into view on the 28th day with 40 riders behind him, and Embervale had never been more alive. That was the thing he hadn't accounted for. He had ridden 300 miles rehearsing the image of a desperate woman clinging to a patch of scrubland with a handful of refugees, something small and fragile that would dissolve the moment real authority arrived. What he found instead, cresting the last ridge before the border, made him pull his horse to a stop so abruptly that the rider behind him nearly collided with his flank. Green. Everywhere green. 2 permanent structures with smoke rising from their chimneys. A spring that caught the morning light like hammered silver. Fields. Actual fields. Planted in rows. Tended. Growing. Paths worn smooth between areas of activity. And people, not a handful, not the desperate few his trackers had initially reported, but what appeared, from this distance, to be somewhere between 80 and 100 souls going about the organized business of a place that had decided it was permanent. Wolves at the perimeter, birds in formations that didn't behave like birds, and at the border, as though she had known the exact hour he would arrive, which, he would later understand, she had, because Finn had returned from the Free Territories with allies and information, and the kind of early warning network that a king who underestimates his opposition never sees coming, stood Aveline Crow. She was wearing deep green. Her silver hair was unbound. She stood with her hands at her sides and her spine in that position he had watched for 48 years, and never once properly understood. Not rigid, not performing, simply certain, the way old trees are certain, the way water is certain of its direction. Beside her, a broad-shouldered farmer with work-scarred hands and the stillness of a man who has chosen his position and will not be moved from it. 4 wolves in a line. 87 people arrayed behind her in the loose formation of people who have not been drilled but have made a shared decision. And at her feet, a small fox who was staring up at Malachar's 40 riders with an expression of comprehensive unimpressedness. Malachar rode forward alone, a calculated move, showing he feared nothing. He stopped 10 feet from the border and looked at Aveline across the distance, and for the first time in 48 years, he looked at her, actually looked, without the filter of a man who has already decided what he sees. She was extraordinary. How had he never? But he pushed the thought down. It wasn't useful. "Aveline," he said, and his voice had the alpha resonance, the full weight of it, the sound that had made warriors step back and elders defer for 30 years. She didn't step back. "Malachar," she said, just his name, no title. The omission landed like a statement. "This ends today," he said. "I've come with 40 riders and the full legal authority of the Voss crown. These lands are hereby claimed under... The blooming covenant supersedes the Voss crown, she said. You know this. Your own legal team confirmed it to you 4 days ago. The man who was writing so quickly during Oswald's visit. His name is Elder Price, and he has spent 30 years in the ancient records. He told you the truth, and you rode here anyway. A muscle in Malakar's jaw moved. Elder Price is... Sitting in the Free Territories right now, she said, along with representatives from 4 independent pacts who have formally recognized Embervale's sovereignty under Covenant law. She let that land, watched it hit. You don't have legal ground, Malakar. You rode 300 miles, and you don't have legal ground. Behind him, 40 riders were very quiet. Thistle from below. Remarkable timing on that sentence. 9.8. Point 2 deducted for not letting the silence sit 1 beat longer, but overall, chef's kiss. Nobody looked at the fox. This was becoming a practiced skill in Embervale. I have 40 armed riders, Malakar said, and the legal argument was gone from his voice now, replaced by something older and uglier, the flat statement of a man returning to the only instrument he's ever truly trusted. And I have the blooming covenant, Aveline said, which means every creature on this land fights for it. She held his gaze. You have 40 riders. I have wolves that don't tire, birds that don't miss, and 87 people who have nothing left to lose because you already took everything from them. A pause. Think carefully about those numbers. From the forest to the east, right on cue, and Aveline had not coordinated this, the land had simply understood what was needed. The sound began. Low at first, then rising, howling from the wolves at the perimeter, joined immediately by others deeper in the new forest, voices multiplying in the dark between the trees until the sound of it pressed against the chest of every rider in Malakar's formation like a physical thing. 3 of the horses shied. 1 rider needed both hands to keep his seat. Malakar's horse held because Malakar was a strong rider, but his knuckles on the reins had gone the color of old bone. Aldous, beside Aveline, said nothing. He simply stood there, present, immovable, the kind of man who makes the space around him feel safer just by occupying it. What happened next, nobody fully predicted. Not Aveline, not Thistle, not even the land itself, perhaps, though the land gave every indication afterward of having planned it precisely. Malakar dismounted. Not a surrender. His chin was too high for surrender, his shoulders too set. But he dismounted, handed his reins to the rider behind him, and walked to the border alone, which was either the most dangerous thing he had done or the first honest thing. And in that moment the difference wasn't entirely clear. He stopped 2 feet from Aveline, close enough that she could see what 48 years had done to his face, and what the last 28 days had done additionally. He looked older than he had in the Great Hall. He looked like a man who had been riding for 300 miles and had, somewhere along that road, lost certainty about what he was riding toward. You were always going to do something like this, he said, and his voice had dropped out of the alpha register entirely, into something quieter and almost unrecognizable. A man's voice, just a man's, and it was somehow more unsettling than the authority. I always knew it. Aveline looked at him steadily. Then why did you wait 48 years to give me the chance? He had no answer. She could see him searching for one and coming up empty, and she understood with complete clarity that this was because there was no answer. There was only a man who had been afraid of what she was and had chosen to diminish her rather than face the fear, and who was standing at the border of what she had built from nothing, and finally, too late, understanding the size of his mistake. Aveline, he started. No, she said. Quietly. Not angry. Something past anger, something clean. Whatever you came here to say, Malakar, I don't need it. Not an apology, not a negotiation, not a plea. She held his gaze. I needed those things 20 years ago. I needed them 10 years ago. I asked for them in ways you never heard because you were never listening." She looked at him for a long, final moment. "I don't need anything from you anymore. That's not cruelty. That's just what you lost when you handed me that cracked carriage and pointed east." The silence between them was complete. 40 riders behind him, 87 people behind her. Wolves, birds, the running spring, the green meadow that had been dead earth less than a month ago. All of it holding its breath. Malachar looked at her for a long time. At the woman he had dissolved before 200 witnesses and sent into dead land with one trunk and no future, who had turned around and built a kingdom. And something moved across his face that she couldn't name and chose not to try. Then he turned, walked back to his horse, mounted, looked at her one final time from the height of the saddle, and she saw it clearly. Not remorse exactly, not a man changed, but a man who has understood something too late to do anything with the understanding. That was its own kind of punishment, and she had not designed it, and did not need to. "The Voss crown will not press the claim," he said, formally, loudly enough for his own riders to hear. "These lands are conceded, under covenant standing." He turned his horse west. 40 riders followed him, and as the last of them disappeared over the ridge, Embervale erupted. Not a cheer this time, but something bigger, less organized, more genuine. The sound of 87 people releasing something they had been carrying in their chests for a very long time. Someone was crying. Someone else was laughing. Bren had his arms around Sable's shoulders. Call and Pell were shaking each other's hands with great seriousness, as though they had agreed on this outcome all along. Finn was standing slightly apart from the crowd with the wide-open face of a young man watching something he will describe to people for the rest of his life. Aldous turned to Aveline, and she turned to him, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 28 days, that steady, clear, completely undisguised look, and said nothing because she was already moving, stepping forward, and when she put both hands against his chest and looked up at him, he brought one hand up to her face with the careful certainty of a man who has been patient long enough. "Finally," she said. "I was waiting for the right moment," he said. "The land has been green for 28 days. I wanted to be sure you were choosing me," he said, "not just the man who was there." She held his gaze. "Aldous Fenwick, you drove 2 miles every morning in the cold to bring me rosemary. I was sure on day 4. He laughed, full and warm and real, a sound she realized she hadn't heard from him before at that volume. And then he kissed her, and the 87 people of Embervale had the extraordinary grace to erupt into sufficient noise that the moment had all the privacy it deserved. Thistle sat 3 feet away with her tail curled around her paws and her eyes closed, radiating the specific contentment of a fox whose work is largely done. 10, she said, to the green land and the morning sky and no one in particular. Absolute 10. I'm taking the rest of the day off. Back on the western road, Malachar rode alone at the front of his column and did not look back. The roses in the eastern courtyard had been dead for 28 days. He had not replanted them. He had told himself he hadn't noticed. He had noticed. 3 weeks after Malachar rode away, Aveline woke before dawn and lay still in the dark of her room. A real room now, in the first permanent building of Embervale, with a window that looked east over the meadow, and noticed that something was different. Not wrong. The opposite of wrong. Something so right it had a specific quality to it, the way the air has a specific quality before rain, except this was interior. A warmth in her body that didn't come from the blankets. A hum in her blood that was new and ancient at the same time. She lay very still and paid attention to it, the way she had learned to pay attention to the land, not demanding, not analyzing, just listening. Outside her window, in the gray pre-dawn, a wolf howled once. Then silence. Then, from the meadow, the sound of birds beginning. One voice, then another, then dozens, the slow orchestra of a world waking up. She pressed one hand flat against her abdomen, the way she pressed her palms to the earth when she wanted to hear what the land was saying. She felt it immediately. Not a heartbeat. Too early for that. Too new. Something earlier. The first possible suggestion of beginning. The cellular whisper of something that had decided to be. She sat up slowly. Her mind went very quiet, which was unusual. Her mind was rarely quiet. She had spent 68 years with a mind full of lists and management, and the constant low vigilance of a woman in a palace that required her to see everything before it arrived. But now, quiet. A held breath. A moment of pure, disbelieving, enormous recognition. She was not barren. She had never been barren. The word Malachar had put on official parchment and read before 200 witnesses, documented, witnessed barren, had never been about her at all. She sat in the dark of her room in the kingdom she had built from dead land, and she let the understanding of it move through her completely. Not the grief, not the anger. Those would come later, perhaps, in smaller, manageable pieces. But right now, just the truth of it, clean and factual and staggering. 48 years of carrying a story about herself that had always belonged to someone else. When she finally moved, she was smiling. She found Aldous before sunrise, as she often did, at the spring, where he went each morning to check the water levels and think in the quiet that he, like her, had always needed before the day properly started. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the path and read her face immediately with the accuracy he had been developing for 28 days of paying close attention. "Sit down," she said. He sat on the stone beside the spring with the prompt compliance of a man who knows when something important is coming and wants to be stable for it. She sat beside him, looked at the water, then at him. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to know that it's the most astonishing thing that's ever happened to me, which is a significant statement given the last month." She held his gaze. "And it involves wolves, specifically wolf cubs." Aldous looked at her for a long moment, with the full attention of a man whose mind was working very quickly behind very still eyes. "Aveline," he said carefully. "Yes," she said. "Are you telling me—" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment that contained several large things. Then, "The Grey Wolf." "The Blooming Covenant," she said. "Thistle explained it to me this morning. I woke her. She was very gracious about it considering the hour." A brief pause, acknowledging that Thistle had been spectacularly not gracious about the hour. "The covenant doesn't just restore land. It restores what was taken. And what was taken from me," she pressed her hand briefly to her abdomen, "was not just a home, was not just a title. It was this." Aldous looked at her hand, back at her face. "Wolf cubs," he said again, processing. "The land's gift," she said. "And yours." She held his gaze steadily. "That's what I needed you to know." He reached over and covered her hand with his, the same gesture as the night at the spring, 3 weeks ago, but different now, heavier and lighter at the same time. And he looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for in any language she knew, which seemed appropriate, because what was happening was also beyond language. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "No," she said. "I'm 68 years old and I'm building a kingdom and apparently I'm going to have wolf cubs, and the man I love is sitting beside a spring at 5 in the morning holding my hand." She looked at the water. "I feel more right than I have ever felt in my life." The word love had come out of her before she'd decided to say it, which was how she knew it was true. She felt Aldous go still beside her, the specific stillness of a man ambushed by something he had been hoping for. "Aveline," he said. "Don't make it complicated," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. "I was going to say, I've known since day 4 as well." She turned to look at him. He was smiling. Not the managed, patient smile she had catalogued all the small private smiles she had been collecting of him, but something wider, something that changed his whole face, something she realized she had been trying to make happen for 28 days and had just succeeded. "The rosemary," she said. "The rosemary," he confirmed. From the path behind them, at a volume that suggested she had been there for considerably longer than was polite, Thistle said, "I would like the record to show that I identified the Covenant pregnancy at 3:47 this morning, approximately 40 minutes before Aveline woke up, because I was already awake because I was conducting important advisory operations, and not because I fell asleep on the spring bank and the cold woke me. Those are two completely different things." Aveline looked over her shoulder at the fox. Thistle was sitting on the path with cold mud on her left side, which somewhat undermined the dignity of the statement. "Of course," Aveline said seriously. "Important advisory operations," Aldous agreed, equally seriously. Thistle narrowed her amber eyes. "I don't appreciate either of you right now." She shook the mud from her fur with great offense. "Someone should have built me a proper shelter weeks ago. I'm raising this in the next council meeting." "You're not on the council," Aveline said. "I'm on every council," Thistle said, already walking back toward camp with her tail high and her dignity fully reconstructed. "I simply haven't formalized it yet. Consider this your notice." The council met that morning, 7 people now, representing the different areas of Embervale's growing population, which had reached 112 by the 21st day after Malakar's departure and was still growing. Finn sat at the table, the Free Territory representative's messages in front of him, reading the terms of 3 separate alliance proposals with the focused seriousness of a young man who had grown up fast in the last month and knew it. Bren managed the eastern expansion. Sable oversaw the water systems. Dorcha, the cheese seller, who had turned out to have a gift for supply logistics that surpassed everyone in camp, including people who had specifically trained for it, managed provisions. Aveline sat at the head of the table and ran the meeting with the same competence she had spent 48 years applying to a palace that never acknowledged it. And the difference was simply this. These people listened. Not out of obligation. Not out of rank. Because she had earned it, day by day, decision by decision, in the full sight of everyone. At the end of the meeting, when the alliance terms had been discussed and the eastern expansion approved and the water channel extension scheduled, Aldous set a cup of tea in front of her without comment, and she picked it up and drank it, and nobody at the table missed the exchange, and everyone at the table had the extraordinary good manners to pretend they had, except Thistle, who was in the corner, who had not been formally invited but was there anyway, who looked at the tea and looked at Aveline and said to Finn beside her in a whisper loud enough for the entire table, "That's what love looks like when it's the right kind. Pay attention. You won't see it explained better than this." Finn looked at Aveline with the tea, at Aldous already moving back to the work of the day, at the spring outside the window running clear through the green land. "I'm paying attention," he said quietly. That evening, Aveline walked the perimeter of Embervale alone, a thing she did every few days, walking the full edge of it, feeling the land under her feet, listening to what it was saying. It always had something to say. She was getting better at hearing it. The gray wolf joined her at the northern edge, falling into step beside her without ceremony, and they walked together in the long blue dusk. The old woman and the great gray wolf, and the green land spreading between them and the first stars coming through overhead. She stopped at the eastern edge, where the meadow met the beginning of the new forest, birch trees now 12 feet tall, which still struck her as extraordinary, and looked out at the darkness between the trees and felt the particular hum she had felt that morning, warm and new and certain. 112 people behind her, 3 alliance proposals on the council table, a man who loved her and had brought her rosemary and built her a shelter and stood beside her when Corvain's horses were in the tree line, a fox who managed the dignity of an ancient advisor while sleeping on spring banks and eating cheese without permission. And this, new, impossible, the Covenant's most astonishing gift, This small beginning that the land had given back to her after 48 years of a man's paperwork claiming she was empty. She had never been empty. She pressed her palm to the earth. The ground was warm under her hand, the way it had been on the first day, and from somewhere deep in the roots of Embervale, something answered her touch. Not a sound, not a word, just a recognition. The land knowing her. Her knowing the land. The oldest conversation there is, between a person and the place that chose them. The gray wolf sat beside her and looked at the dark forest and breathed slow, and Aveline breathed with him, and the first stars brightened overhead, and Embervale held them both in the blue and living dark. It had not finished growing. None of them had. 300 miles west, in a palace where the eastern courtyard roses had been dead for 7 weeks, Malachar sat alone at his breakfast table and received the morning report from his steward. Embervale had signed its first formal alliance with the Free Territories. Its population had exceeded 100. The Blooming Covenant had been entered into the ancient records as a legitimate sovereign claim. He set the report down. He looked at the empty chair across the table. The chair where, for 48 years, Aveline had sat every morning, her hands around a cup, already thinking 3 things ahead, already managing something, already being the thing he had never looked at directly enough to see. He did not eat breakfast. He was not sure he deserved to. 6 months after Aveline Crow had stepped off a broken carriage onto dead ground with 1 trunk and no future, Embervale held its first founding ceremony. And every single thing that could go wrong did, in the specific way that only happens when too many people who care deeply about something are trying to do it all at once. The ceremonial arch that Bren had spent 2 weeks constructing collapsed at dawn, 40 minutes before the guests arrived, taking with it 12 hand-dyed banners, a table of ceremonial bread, and Thistle's personal dignity, as the fox had been sitting on top of the arch conducting what she described as a final structural assessment when it went down. She emerged from the wreckage with a bread roll in her mouth and a banner draped across her back like a cape, and announced, with the absolute unshakable composure of a creature who has decided to make every disaster look intentional. I loosened it deliberately. The new arch will be stronger. You're welcome. Nobody believed her. Everyone let her have it. Cole and Pell rebuilt the arch in 3 hours, with the focused efficiency of men who had learned that on any given day in Embervale, something would need rebuilding, and had simply made peace with this as a professional reality. By mid-morning, it stood stronger than before, the banners rehung, the bread replaced by Dorsha, who had, as always, anticipated the possibility of catastrophe and prepared accordingly. "How did you know we'd need backup bread?" Finn asked her. "I always make backup bread," she said. "I have lived long enough to know that ceremony and disaster are first cousins." The guests came from 4 directions. From the west, the Free Territory Pack elders, 7 of them, traveling together, arriving on horseback with the formal bearing of people attending something they had decided mattered. Their lead elder was a woman named Azara, white-haired and sharp-eyed, who dismounted, looked at Embervale in full morning light, the 2 permanent buildings, the fields, the spring, the new forest 12 feet tall where dead ground had been 6 months ago, and said simply, without diplomatic preamble, "We should have come sooner." "You're here now," Aveline said, and meant it without resentment, because she had found that resentment required energy she no longer had interest in spending. From the north, 3 independent settlement representatives who had been in correspondence with Finn for 2 months, arriving with trade proposals already written and the practical energy of people who had decided Embervale was a place worth connecting to. From the east, families, still coming, still arriving, the steady stream that had not stopped in 6 months, people who had heard and come, who had come and stayed, who had stayed and built. Embervale's population had reached 240 by sunrise that morning, and Sable had reported, with the expression of a woman who has stopped being surprised by anything, that 17 more had arrived overnight. And from the south, unexpected, unannounced, riding alone without ceremony, came Elder Price, the man who had been writing so furiously during Oswald's legal visit, the man from the ancient records who had told Malachar the truth about the Blooming Covenant and been ignored. He dismounted at the border, walked to where Aveline stood receiving guests, and stopped before her with the particular humility of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is finally setting it down. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "I knew what the covenant meant the moment I saw those lands responding to you. I told the king. I should have also told you." He reached into his coat and produced a document. Old, carefully preserved, sealed with a wax impression Aveline didn't recognize. The original Blooming Covenant, the full text. It belongs here. It has always belonged with the queen it chose. She took it with both hands, the way you take something that has weight beyond its physical weight. "Thank you for coming," she said, "and for telling him the truth, even when he didn't want it. That matters." Elder Price looked at her, at Embervale behind her, at the wolves at the perimeter, at the green fields where dead earth had been, and something in his face went from burdened to something lighter. "What you've done here," he said quietly, "is not something the records have seen before." He looked at her abdomen, where the evidence of the covenant's most extraordinary gift was now clearly, visibly present. 6 months along, undeniable, the wolf cubs moving sometimes in the early morning in ways that made Aldous put his hand very gently against her side and go entirely still with wonder. "The records will need to be updated." "I'll send you everything," she said. "Embervale should be in the records." He nodded, moved on, and Aveline turned to the next arriving guest, and the next, and the next, managing it all with the ease of someone who had spent 48 years managing infinitely more complicated situations with infinitely less support. The ceremony itself was nothing like a palace ceremony. There was no choreography, no precise timing, no sequence of formal gestures designed to impress visiting dignitaries. There was a circle. Embervale's people and its guests gathered in the meadow around the spring in the afternoon light, with the wolves at the outer edge and the birds in the trees, and Thistle seated on the gray wolf's back in a position she had fully claimed as her ceremonial throne. Aveline stood at the center, beside Aldous, and she wore the deep green she had been wearing the day Malachar arrived, because it was the color of what this land had chosen to become, and she found she wanted to match it. Izara, as the eldest of the formal witnesses, spoke first, recognizing Embervale's sovereignty, its covenant standing, its right to exist independent of any alpha crown. Her words were formal and precise and legally complete, and when she finished there was a silence that was not empty but full, the kind of silence that settles after something important has been said correctly. Then Aveline spoke. Not a speech. She had not prepared a speech, because she found that prepared speeches were for people who didn't trust what they actually meant to say. And she trusted herself now in a way she hadn't 6 months ago, in a way she hadn't, perhaps, for 48 years. 6 months ago, she said, and her voice carried easily in the meadow quiet. I walked onto dead ground because I had nowhere else to go. I was 68 years old, I had one trunk, and the carriage I arrived in was broken. She looked at Aldous, who was looking at her. Someone helped me up, and then someone else came, and then someone else, and here you all are. She looked at the faces, Bren, Sable, Finn, Dorsha, Cole and Pell, Elder Price, Izara and her elders, 240 people who had come from all directions to a place that had been dead and was now this. Embervale is not mine. It never was. The covenant gave me the ground and all of you built the kingdom. That's what I want in the records, not a queen who made something, but a people who chose to. The meadow was quiet for a moment. Then Finn started it, his voice just beginning to change, not the steadiest instrument, but he started it and that was enough. And the rest came in, all of them. The sound filling the meadow and climbing into the new birch trees and going up into the afternoon sky over Embervale. Thistle, on the gray wolf's back, tucked her nose under her paw briefly. The gray wolf made no comment, but his tail moved once, slowly, and from a wolf of that seniority, in that moment, it was enough. Afterward, when the guests had been fed and the alliances formally signed and the light had gone gold and long over the meadow, Aveline and Aldous walked the perimeter together the way she walked it every few days, the way he had started joining her, the way it had become theirs, their particular version of a quiet conversation that didn't always require words. She walked slower now than she had 6 months ago, and he matched her pace without comment, without making it a thing, simply adjusting the way he adjusted to everything, practically, immediately, without drama. All the pontas soltas, she said, in the private language of someone going through a list. Malachar conceded the claim formally, Aldous said. It's in the records now. He can't reverse it. Vera? Sent a messenger last month. She left the palace. Apparently she found that what she'd wanted wasn't what she'd gotten. A pause. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure it was relevant. It isn't, Aveline agreed. Davin? Bren escorted him to the border the morning after you identified him and told him not to return. He hasn't. Oswald. Retired from legal practice, Thistle said from somewhere near their ankles, because Thistle was always somewhere near their ankles. I may have sent a comprehensive document to the ancient records regarding his attempted use of invalid legal precedents, professionally, in my capacity as chief counsel of Embervale. Aveline and Aldous looked at each other. She's on the council, Aldous said. She's on the council, Aveline confirmed. I have always been on the council, Thistle said serenely. I simply waited for you to catch up. They walked on. The meadow spread around them in the evening gold, and the spring ran, and the wolves moved at the perimeter, and somewhere in the new forest a bird sang the same descending phrase it sang every evening at this hour, which Aveline had learned to listen for the way you listen for something that has become necessary. She pressed her hand to her side, where one of the cubs moved, a slow, rolling pressure that still stopped her breath slightly every single time, the staggering biological fact of it, the Covenant's impossible and perfect answer to 48 years of a word written on a scroll. Aldous put his hand over hers without being asked. They stood still for a moment in the middle of Embervale, the living land around them and the evening coming on and all of it, exactly as it was meant to be. Are you happy? He asked, the way he asked things, directly, because he genuinely wanted to know, because her answer always mattered to him. She considered it, the way she considered everything now, fully, without first checking whether the answer was acceptable. Yes, she said. And then, because it was true, and she had learned to say true things, for the first time in my life, completely. He kissed her temple, left his lips there for a moment. The evening light moved across the green land. It was enough. It was everything. Epilogue 1 year after the founding ceremony. The ancient records of the Free Territories listed Embervale as a sovereign kingdom under blooming Covenant law, the first of its kind in recorded history. Population: 308. The Grey Wolf, designated first guardian of Embervale, had not left the perimeter in 12 months. Thistle held the position of chief counsel, formally, with a carved wooden nameplate that Finn had made her and that she accepted with the composure of someone who had expected nothing less. 3 wolf cubs were born on the first day of spring, healthy, loud, and immediately opinionated, which Thistle said was entirely her influence and which no one had the energy to argue. Aldous Fenwick never returned to his farm 2 miles north. He was asked once by a new arrival what his title was in Embervale. He thought about it and said, "I'm the one who brings the rosemary." The new arrival wrote it down. It appeared in the records that way and no one corrected it. Malachar died the following winter, in the palace, in the chair at the head of the table. The Voss kingdom passed to a council of elders, which was the first competent governance it had known in 30 years. The eastern courtyard was replanted in spring by someone who thought it deserved flowers. Aveline Crow, Queen of Embervale, Luna of the Blooming Covenant, the woman who had walked into dead ground at 68 and made it breathe, woke every morning before the sun, pressed her palms to the earth outside her door, and felt the land answer. It always answered. It had been waiting for her its entire life. If something in this story moved you, the moment she tore the scroll, the night at the spring, the morning she understood she had never been what they said she was, leave it in the comments. This land was built for you too. And if you want to know what happens when a woman who has already survived everything walks into a world that finally deserves her, come back. There are more kingdoms waiting to be born.